It has not been anywhere near 2 hours. Furthermore, we
That is not a point of
started
order,
late.
that's a point of debate. Go ahead, Mr. Julian.
So the House of Commons gave us a job to do. Conservatives seem to want to block doing that job. I would ask through you to them, Mr. Chair, that they allow the votes to be held, to stop blocking this legislation. It's been before the House since February 29th. Conservatives have blocked it every single step. The reason why 3 months later it is not yet passed through committee is because Conservatives have been blocking it at every single turn. And 6 million Canadians with diabetes, 9 million Canadians who need access to contraception, including basic fundamental
Point of order.
reproductive rights.
Dr. Ellis on a point of order.
Again, Chair, we have heard these statistics previously, so this is very repetitive, and if you wish to allow that, I've got lots more to say, Chair. So please be consistent. I implore you.
I think you have lots more to say, regardless of what my ruling might be. Mr. Julian, please get to the point, if you would, please.
The point is, I ask my Conservative colleagues to move forward on the bill. Stop blocking the bill.
Thank you. Dr. Ellis.
Thank you very much, Chair. You know, I'll keep this brief. We're not blocking this bill. What we're doing is it's important that Canadians understand what this bill and what it isn't. This is not a filibuster. How can you filibuster something when it's already time allocated? It's an impossibility. When we get to 8:30 today, on behalf of Canadians, we will have to vote anyway, even though there's been very little testimony and also very little discussion. So this is not a filibuster. This is an educational session with respect to the failures of the NDP Liberal Costly Coalition, which we now know is sadly irritating Mr. Julian and him wanting to get on. We can't block this bill. If we were blocking this bill, the bill would still be in the House of Commons. And we also know that because Mr. Nakvi wants to ask me to go home and do bizarre things alone, you know, that is obviously irritating him as well. And perhaps that he thinks that being able to say words like the minister has in the House of Commons is helpful, that we can all say penis and vagina here in committee. Well, that's not bothersome to be able to say that. But I don't believe that 1 second that's what Canadians are asking us to do here. Canadians are asking me to say, what is your opposition to this bill? And I've been very clear in helping Canadians understand what that is the trouble with this bill. And certainly at every chance we get, we are trying to be helpful to make this better. So at that point, Chair, I'm happy to cede the floor.
The speaker's list is now exhausted. We are therefore ready for the question. Shall CPC 7 carry? All those in favor, please raise your hand.
Chair, we'd request a recorded division, please.
Recorded division has been requested, Madam Clerk.
Thank you. On CPC 7, Dr. Hanley.
No.
Ms. Kayabega.
No.
Mr. Nakvi.
No.
Dr. Pulaski.
No.
Ms. Sidhu.
No.
Mr. Doherty.
Yes.
Dr. Ellis.
Yes.
Ms. Goodridge.
Yes.
Dr. Kitchen.
Yes.
Monsieur Blanchet-Jonca.
Contre.
Merci. Mr. Julian.
No to the filibuster.
Thank you. 2, 5, 6, 7. 7 nays, 4 yeas.
CPC 7 is therefore defeated, and that brings us to CPC 8 in the name of Dr. Ellis. Would you like to move CPC 8, Dr. Ellis?
Thank you very much, Chair. And certainly our office had a bit of a back and forth with the legislative clerks with respect to the exact wording. What our attempt here, and I think this is important, and if we haven't gotten it correct, I'm quite happy to hear from my colleagues and from the legislative clerks as well to understand exactly what the appropriate wording is to be the most inclusive. with Aboriginal people in Canada, and that was the actual reasoning behind this wording. So through you, Chair, I don't know if the legislative clerks have any more input, but that was simply to be attempting to ensure that we were inclusive as possible. So I'll leave it at that, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. My advice from the clerks at the table is that the wording that is contained in CPC 8 was wording that was decided upon after consultation with Legislative Council, and the clerks at the table have nothing to add. That it looks like the homework is already done. Any further interventions with respect to CPC 8?
Can you, Chair, can you explain that again?
Well, maybe we'll have the clerks tell you what they told me. Go ahead.
Thank you for the question. So as as legislative clerks, we are there to give advice to the committee to procedural questions. And this is not a question that has anything to do with procedure. It's more a legal question. So the question may be directed to the officials, but we are not legislative council, so we cannot comment on the wording.
Thank you. So the question that is the wording correct or is it incorrect, what's being suggested?
I don't think there's anyone here that can answer that. It was my understanding that there were discussions with Legislative Council before this came forward. So whatever advice they gave to the mover or the drafter, it would be between them. I'm not privy to it, and nor are the clerks to my right. So I see Mr. Nackvey and Ms. Goodridge, unless you had something else, Mr. Doherty.
No, I just wanted to see if this was put forth, if it was the correct version or not.
Yeah. Mr. Nackvey and then Ms. Goodridge.
Thank you very much, and I think it is an appropriate question. It is my understanding that Indigenous peoples is the appropriate term and most inclusive term, given that that's the term that appears in other pieces of legislation as well. For example, the UNDRIP implementation legislation, very similar to how the legislation speaks to provinces and territories, not provincial and territorial governments. It's not the place of the legislation to define what kind of governing body per se, but perhaps, Chair, if I can ask the officials from Health Canada if they could advise us as to using Indigenous peoples is the appropriate term and the inclusive term to use in this particular legislation.
Entirely appropriate. That's why they're here. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The broader term Indigenous peoples is in fact inclusive, as that would be our view. And of course, in preparing the legislation, we would have done this due diligence as well. So I would agree with the earlier comments.
Thank you. Ms. Goodridge, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses. And this is something, the rationale behind bringing this forward is that there are both Indigenous governing bodies as well as Indigenous people more wholly, and it is in an attempt to both recognize that there are organizations that fall within a governing body and Indigenous individuals that do not, and we want to try and be as inclusive as possible when it comes to the conversation around this. And it was a challenging space with how limited we were in terms of getting this and the ability to get the amendments done in time to truly be able to understand. And my understanding is, in working with the law clerks in drafting this amendment, Indigenous governing bodies is in fact a legal term, and in fact we have CPC two that eventually we will get to that does give the definition as per the Constitution Act of 1982, which should in theory do this. And so my question is, would this be inappropriate?
Miss, please go ahead.
Again, maybe just to return to my earlier comment, the term Indigenous peoples is used as an inclusive term here, and it's also a term that is used in other legislation. So when we are looking at bringing forward legislation, we look at consistency and do that due diligence as well. What I would add as well is that in the sense that it's inclusive, it does not limit the interpretation that's being suggested, i.e. it is inclusive of exactly the wording that's being put forward. So there's a redundancy there. It's already included.
Anything else, Ms. Goodrich? You good? Mr. Julian, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be voting against this amendment for that reason, that the inclusive terminology that's already present in other government bills would be confused by the nature of the CPC amendment. I'm a little confused because the Conservatives certainly had since February 29th to prepare amendments to this bill, and certainly 3 weeks ago the House, in frustration after months of Conservatives blocking this bill, the motion of instruction was tabled, so there was certainly 3 weeks. You gave, Mr. Chair, a week and a half notice prior to the amendment deadline, so there's been like 3 reminders since February 29th. So I'm a little surprised that the Conservatives didn't heed all of that, and I guess kind of put something in at the last moment. That being said, this is not the appropriate way of amending the bill, and that's why I'll be voting no.
Dr. Ellis and then Mr. Doherty.
Thank you very much, Chair. You know, this, despite what Mr. Julian wants to portray, this is after considerable consultation with the Legislative Council to understand the terminology. That was a question that we had. This isn't that, you know, unlike the NDP, it's not something we just dreamt up on the back of a napkin yesterday and tried to bring forward here or through a table-dropped amendment. So I take great umbrage with his ridiculous notion that this is something that was not well thought out or actually consulted upon. So that's an absolutely ridiculous accusation and something that I wish it didn't bear a response, but it does because of the ridiculous and unwarranted nature of his inflammatory comments, which I have could only believe are intended to be inflammatory in this context. So as I mentioned, and because of that, in spite of that, I'm quite happy if everybody else around this table is convinced that this is not the appropriate reference. I'm quite happy to seek unanimous consent to withdraw it. As I said, this is based on the legal counsel that we obtained from the House of Commons. It's not like we went out and sought separate legal counsel for this. This is the actual counsel that we received, and therefore we believed that it was important to do it. This is not meant to be contentious or perhaps, as Mr. Julian is thinking, that this is part of a filibuster. This is meant to be inclusive of all the appropriate people who had come to the table who potentially could be impacted by the Farmer Care pamphlet. So if it's the, in your terminology, Chair, if it's the will of the room to say that in spite of the good counsel that I believe we received, that this is not a helpful amendment, I'm happy to seek unanimous consent to withdraw it.
Are you seeking unanimous consent?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Is it the will of the committee that CPC 8 be withdrawn? I see agreement around the table. I don't hear any nays. CPC 8 is therefore withdrawn by unanimous consent. Brings us to CPC 9. Standing in the name of Dr. Ellis, would you like to move CPC 9, Dr. Ellis?
With great pleasure, Chair. You know, what we have here is that Bill C-64 in Clause 3 be amended by replacing lines 10 and 11 on page 3 with the following, and I quote, "drugs and related products intended for contraception or the treatment of diabetes, and to provide for the continuation of the national bulk purchasing strategy." I think there's two things to be mindful of here. And again, without wanting to be repetitive, I did hear your words from Bosch and Gagnon. However, we know that this is not universal pharmacare. This is not, there was absolutely no mention in the testimony, Chair, of any other classes of medications other than contraception and diabetes. Those things did not come up, and if anybody can point me to testimony, if I'm incorrect in that, I would absolutely love to hear it, but we did not hear any evidence or testimony to the contrary of those two things. And the other testimony that we did hear was very clearly that a national bulk purchasing strategy is already in existence. So for this, again, this is not a transparent bill. This is fleecing the Canadian public into suggesting that this will somehow miraculously create some new national bulk purchasing strategy. And that is why it's exceedingly important. Words are important. Words matter. The word continuation of the national bulk purchasing strategy that already exists. There's no evidence in this bill to the contrary, nor was there any testimony to the contrary. And again, I'll challenge anybody around the table to say that there was different testimony to suggest that a new national bulk purchasing strategy would result from the passage of the pharmacare pamphlet. That is not where we are at. And certainly, it's also important that Canadians understand, as we talked about during the testimony with respect to the pharmacare pamphlet, that the process from Health Canada through the PMPRB to the now Canadian Drug Agency, the former Canadian Agency for Drugs and Therapeutics and Health, or also known as CADTH, and then on to the PCPA and the responsibility to the provincial, and yes, I did say the provincial ministers of health, that we heard that that jurisdiction exists, and that we also heard that significant delays happen with respect to that significant and belabored process. We did hear testimony that the length of time from the original notice of assessment all the way through the process to being listed on 50% of public formularies was often excessive, depending on the reference, most often in the realm of 27 months or more than 2 years and 3 months. We also heard that 44% of drugs that were introduced to many other markets, all the markets actually in the OECD countries, between 2012 and 2021, of those in the United States, 85% were listed on formularies and 44% were listed here in Canada. So we have a significant problem, but this is not the problem. The problem doesn't appear, well, maybe it is related to bulk purchasing. It's beyond the purview of the pharmacare pamphlet. But it's also important that the other testimony we heard is related to the number of drugs covered on private plans, and less than half of those are covered on any public plans. So on behalf of Canadians, I think it important and it behooves this committee to ensure that there is that transparency, that lack of opaqueness for Canadians to hear that the likelihood of creating a national pharmacare program for drugs in contraception and diabetes that is better than the plan they have now, which could in fact restrict, and we heard this many times with respect to testimony, I'll go back to that, that we heard testimony from folks who said that it's very likely that this could restrict your ability to have your own private plan. It would also disincentivize employers from offering plans for their employees when a restricted in number plan, in number of medications covered plan, which this pamphlet would create for these two specific disease states, that could create problems for Canadians who over 80% of them have private drug plans and actually value their plans. And when we know that this is important to Canadians, taking away that freedom, that ability to choose how they wish to be compensated from their employer and the drugs that they wish to have access to treat their conditions is very, very challenging to say the best and frightening to say the worst. I think the other testimony that we heard, Chair, is related to single drug coverage in a generic state. And if I might take a minute just to explain that. For instance, on the list of diabetes medication was a drug called metformin. So metformin is probably the most commonly prescribed medication for type 2 diabetes at the current time. It's been around for a very, very long time. And what we do know is that in Canada, excuse me, at the current time, there exists 22 different generic manufacturers for metformin in Canada. And we also know that, sadly, Canada suffers from multiple and repeated drug shortages, such that people will often be switched from one generic brand to another. Apologies. Sorry. Oh, no. And so, Chair, when we see on the list that has been put on the Canada.ca website with respect to diabetes medications, we see one form of metformin, which then, when you begin to look at the pharmacoeconomics associated with the manufacturing and distribution of drugs, what we see is that the likelihood that the Canadian supply chain could be easily disrupted by a shortage, whether it be on an international basis from the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the APIs, which mainly come from India and China, that particular company could be negatively impacted and therefore not be able to manufacture metformin on behalf of Canadians. When we have 22 manufacturers and we have no assurances that we could actually end up with one manufacturer, then we know that on behalf of Canadians, this could create a significant and negative impact. So again, the rationale for this amendment is related to clarity. This is about contraception and diabetes, and there is now a national bulk purchasing strategy through the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which is run by the provinces and finally determined and acted upon if deemed necessary by the provincial ministers of health. So let's not conflate things this bill does and doesn't do. I know that the NDP Liberal Costly Coalition wants Canadians to believe that this is a universal pharmacare bill about a multitude of drugs and about a new bulk purchasing strategy. That is not what is occurring here in this bill. So on behalf of Canadians, I implore everyone around this table to vote in favor of this amendment. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. Are there any further interventions with respect to CPC 9? Mr. Julian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The reality is this does the exact same thing that was attempted in the other Conservative amendment, which is to limit national pharmacare. And I wanted to all members reiterate Section 11 of the bill. Committee of Experts that within 1 year of the date in which this act receives royal assent provides a written recommendation to the minister on options for the operation and financing of national universal single-payer pharmacare. So the intent is very clear, as we heard in repeated testimony, and from not only from those who are urging that we adopt this bill, but also those looking at phase two. The possible outcomes of that committee of experts could very well be to recommend to move immediately to the heart medication. And I referenced earlier, Mr. Chair, my constituent lives a few blocks from my home, who pays $1,000 a month for heart medication.
Point of order,
So-
Chair. Point of order.
Order from Dr. Ellis.
I'm not entirely sure why Mr. Julian wants to continue to mislead Canadians and go on representing the same facts over and over again, suggesting that this bill is going to be more than it is, and that he also wants to, as you said, be repetitive talking about heart medications, which is not in this bill at all. There's no mention of heart medications here, and he continues to be repetitive. So, Chair, once again, I implore you to use your ruling about the repetitive nature of his comments.
Dr. Ellis, this has been Mr. Julian's first intervention with respect to CPC 9. He is absolutely entitled, under the rule of repetition, to make the exact same arguments in connection with every question put to the committee. So there's been no violation of the rule of repetition, technical or actual. Go ahead, Mr. Julian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Ellis does have a point. The Conservative CPC 9 does exactly that. It limits this bill so you can't go to heart medication. And that's why I'm voting against this. The Conservatives are doing what they're accusing the bill of doing, and that is to restrict pharmacare so that it never goes to heart medication and these other medications where Canadians are paying $1,000 or $1,500 a month. So that's why I'm opposing CPC 9. Conservatives are saying, gosh, this bill doesn't do enough, but we're going to stop it so the bill doesn't do anything else. And that, of course, is a contradiction, one might say hypocrisy, that I think everyone understands. So I'm voting no on CPC 9.
Thank you. Ms. Goodrich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do believe Mr. Doherty had the floor, but I will go because I was told to go. I appreciate the prerogative there. My question, and I appreciate the fact that the member from the NDP is so well versed when it comes to this bill and can cite exactly which section different pieces are in, and I guess it stands to reason, because this is probably the only time in the federal NDP's situation where they will be responsible for drafting a piece of government legislation. And so I can understand the amount of effort that they would put in, because this is part of their supply and confidence agreement, and them selling many parts of their soul of a party to prop up a government. And they're voting in favor of time allocation and all kinds of other pieces that the previous iterations of this party would be rolling over in their graves. But to get back to the piece of this particular legislation, it's the continuation of the national bulk purchasing strategy. Because in this legislation, it makes it sound as if somehow this is this brilliant new thing that is going to revolutionize the way how Canadians access their medication, and that somehow we're not already paying fair prices. And we did hear from witness testimony, although very limited witness testimony, that there already exists a national bulk purchasing strategy. It's actually kind of frustrating. When we were hearing from the witnesses, normally the tradition of this committee, we find out in advance who has invited each one of the witnesses. It gives an opportunity to better prepare as we're going forward in this. And yet, in this particular case, we didn't find out who invited the various witnesses. In fact, it's worth noting for the record that we still don't know who invited which particular witness. I have some theories as to which party invited a majority of the witnesses based on some of the testimony that came out, but we don't actually know which party was responsible for inviting most of the witnesses, which is the standard tradition here. And so I really, my question to the officials here, does Canada already have a national bulk purchasing strategy?
So two parts to the answer to that question. So first is that Canada does have, through the support of provinces and territories, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which has existed since 2010. And it does report that as of April 1st, 2023, savings from the activities to participating in public drug plans are estimated to be $3.89 billion annually. With respect to the context of the bill itself, it refers to a plan or a development of a national bulk purchasing strategy advice coming from the Canadian Drug Agency. So that as yet does not exist.
So thank you. I appreciate that. So the continuation of a national bulk purchasing strategy wouldn't necessarily contravene anything that Canada's currently doing. Is that correct?
With respect to what the Bill C-64 commits to, which is the generation of advice upon request to the minister, that would not be being continued because it doesn't exist yet.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So my next question, and perhaps Ms. Boudreau, you can answer. On Thursday, I had asked how long you guys had been working on this particular bill, and at one point you said a few months, and then a year, and then it was back to, well, a couple months. Have you been able to clarify how long you've been working on this bill?
We have been able to do that. I am going to ask my colleague to do it simply because he wrote down all the numbers before we came. But my recollection from my response was the amount of time we had spent working on some of the policy work and then when we had started the actual drafting. So I'll let my colleague fill in those numbers for you.
Yeah, so I think the essence of the response that was given last time when we gave witness testimony was referencing the nature of policy development is not necessarily a linear and continuous such that it has a defined start and end, which is all a way of saying that from the beginning of the process of developing something, all of the options that got assessed, advice was provided to minister in the course of, it actually was prior to my joining the unit itself, so it has been going for more than 2 years is an easy estimate.
So, I didn't ask about the policy development. I asked how long was this legislation, how long did it take you guys to draft this?
So drafting of legislation and all of the work that goes into that, it tends to occur concurrently with the policy development because the two go hand in hand.
So then in this case, did it happen concurrently or was this an anomaly?
There was nothing anomalous about this process in terms of when you're developing legislation or you're developing the policy advice that's going to lead to the instrument of the use of legislation. You do work with all of the agency, all of the elements of the public service that support legislative drafting through that process.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Doherty, and then Dr. Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I sat on this for some. I had my hand up and was on the speakers list, I believe, for CPC 8, and then it was withdrawn. But the point I wanted to make with that is I asked an honest question regarding the ruling on it, and our colleague from the NDP took the opportunity to go on and take a partisan shot suggesting that we were filibustering that just because I asked a simple question. It's theater for him because the cameras are on, and he takes every opportunity to slam us when it was an honest question that I had regarding CPC 8 and the inclusion or the words Indigenous peoples, Indigenous governing bodies, and that. I want to further, which is why I'm using the opportunity now to bring this up. Just because we ask a question or that we are bringing forth reasonable amendments, we're not it's not a filibuster because we're asking these questions, because we honestly want to get this right for Canadians. The question that we have and the points that we're making is, again, that this is not a farmer care bill. I'll draw the attention of the committee to page 4, clause 6. The last line of it is that it starts, the minister may, if the minister has entered into an agreement with the province or territory to do so, make payments to the province or territory. And the last line, for the specific, make payments for the specific prescription drugs and related products intended for contraception or the treatment of diabetes. Our colleague from the NDP has brought up his concerns regarding heart medication. They will stand up and they'll say that they have got this done for Canadians, that every Canadian, that whatever the stats are, 9 million Canadians that are struggling with or that are diabetic, or whatever those stats are for that, which we have said that this is important for those Canadians that struggle with those issues. Why didn't they fight for the heart medication, the folks that are cardiac patients? Why can't this bill be amended, or why couldn't they have fought for those Canadians that are struggling with other serious long-term diseases and issues, medical issues that require access to medication? That is they want to build this as pharmacare, a pharmacare bill or a national pharmacare program. Well, why wouldn't they, when they're sitting around the table with their coalition partners, why wouldn't they have fought for that? Mr. Julian will grab the mic probably more times throughout the course of this evening and talk about his constituent that has $1,000 a month for heart medication. I'm certain that Mr. Julian would have known about this when he was at the table negotiating this piece of legislation. Why didn't he fight for that at that time? How many millions of Canadians require that medication? Does he have those stats? It is, it's frustrating. Again, I use that term because, again, this is not a pharmacare piece of legislation. It deals with contraception and the treatment of diabetes, nothing else. This CPC 9, this is a reasonable amendment, again, dealing with what this piece of legislation is truly about, and that's it. Mr. Julian's already stated his intentions to vote against it. I will suggest that he's going to vote against all of the CPC amendments because, well, they're common sense, and we've seen that the NDP, at least within the last number of years, of that common sense has gone out the door with their costly coalition. So it is frustrating for me. It's frustrating when we ask a simple question. My question regarding CPC 8 was short and to the point, asking for clarification. And Mr. Julian should have just probably looked at the camera and spoke directly to Canadians, because that's who he was acting for, putting on the act for. It was not a filibuster at all. It was simply to get clarification, and I take offense to the fact that he says that we are filibustering that simple point, that simple amendment. Thanks.
Dr. Ellis? Thank you very much, Chair. And if I could direct perhaps a couple of questions to the officials. Mr. McDonald, I was paying attention, but maybe I missed some of the nuance of what you were saying. And this is not well defined in the bill, and again, that's probably what's creating the difficulty. Are you suggesting that a national bulk purchasing strategy, as talked about in this bill, will then see the elimination of the PCPA?
No, that's not at all. what I was referencing or inferencing at all.
I'm sorry, sir. Could you just maybe move closer to the mic or vice versa? I'm just struggling hearing you. And I couldn't put my piece
Apologies
in
for
it.
that.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
That sounds better. No, that was not at all what I was suggesting. What I was simply stating, two parts in the response to the question. First is the existing coordination of price negotiation that provinces and territories have set up through the existing Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. And I was just simply distinguishing that from the advice that the minister under the Bill C-64 would be seeking from the Canadian Canada's Drug Agency to suggest a future development of or forwarding of. It was not intended in any way in my remark to suggest that there would be a replacement of existing activities. It's just supporting the discussion amongst provinces, territories, Indigenous peoples, and other partners and stakeholders about where to next and what improvements might be made.
Thanks very much. And through you, Chair, if I might, to you, Mr. MacDonald. So then the question is, are you saying that in a forward-looking bill that the CDA, which is just brand new, newly formed, are you suggesting then that they would do pricing negotiations? Is that what you're suggesting? Because you know what? Again, on behalf of Canadians, I'm seeking clarity here, and I'm not obtaining it. I apologize for that, but is that what you're saying?
Not at all. What the National Bulk Purchasing section of Bill C-64 refers to is, seeking a term here, more improvements in the existing price negotiation steps that are taken in the pharmaceutical management system in Canada today. Where might improvements be sought? How might that be affected? It's intended to be an expert guided conversation, and the Canada Drug Agency is suited to guide that conversation. But it is not intended to be in any way a replacement for the PCPA. I just want to be clear about that.
Thank you very much, and Chair, if I might. So if this is not a new national bulk purchasing strategy, then therefore, in my mind, the word continuation of a national bulk purchasing strategy would be most appropriate. If you're telling me that the Canadian Drug Agency is not about to replace what exists now within the PCPA, then continuation would be most appropriate. It's not setting up something new. Is that what I heard?
So it's just distinguishing between, so the activities of the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance are ongoing now and continuing, and what the bill references is the development of advice that would support a conversation amongst provinces, territories, Indigenous peoples, other partners and stakeholders about where to next, what might happen for the future development of national pharmacare. So it's distinguished between the actual activity that's occurring now, that's the PCPA that you're referring to, not terminating or any way that, but it's about the development of advice to support a conversation about the future development of pharmacare.
Well, thanks very much. And through you, Chair, though, Mr. MacDonald, doesn't that advice already exist from the now, well, it's not really defunct, but the now being replaced CADIF, that they already created advice around pricing and risk-benefit, cost-benefit, pharmacoeconomics? That was already part of their mandate, was it not?
That was generally part of their mandate as a health technology association. You're correct. This is about the minister being able to seek a specific piece of advice about where in Canada in future, as part of future pharmacare, where coordinated price negotiation, where improvements might be made, because it is an important element of pharmacare as a total package.
Thanks very much, and I will continue along that line of questioning because I'm not, you know what, again, this is about transparency. So, listen, I know I'm here as a parliamentarian, but on behalf of the average Canadian, what it appears to me that you're saying in a multitude of different ways, and I don't believe that you're trying to be obtuse in your answers, but it would appear what you're trying to tell me is that the future vision of pharmacare would suggest that the Canadian Drug Agency would do what now the PCPA is doing. And without understanding what the Costly Coalition's vision is, it becomes very difficult for me to understand what it is you're saying. Not because I don't understand English, I do, but your answer is obtuse without perhaps meaning to, and I don't mean to be negative towards your answers, but if I don't have an understanding of what the negotiated vision is, because you might have been part of it, we were not. We who represent the opposition were not part of that conversation around what the vision is on behalf of Canadians. And you know what? I think that Canadians deserve to know what the vision is. And if the vision means that there's going to be a new national bulk purchasing strategy, which will be under the purview of the Canadian Drug Agency, then they need to hear that. And if it's not, then the wording, which is in this amendment, which talks about, as my colleague eloquently pointed out, page 4, I believe, paragraph 6, that this is specifically about diabetes and contraception, and it's also about the continuation of a national bulk purchasing strategy. So I'm going to ask you to be concrete, which I know you don't want to be, I understand that, but either this is the creation of a new pathway under the auspices of the Canada Drug Agency, or it is the continuation of a national bulk purchasing strategy. So I ask you, sir, on behalf of Canadians, which is it?
So two parts there. So first, this is not creating a role or a new role for Canada's Drug Agency in the realm of price negotiations. So I just want to be very clear about that. The bill sets up a future conversation about the future of pharmacare. Now, as part of that, the bill sets out that the minister may request advice from the Canada's Drug Agency on two elements to develop expert advice to support that conversation. And so one of those two pieces is to guide the development of advice on where might Canada go in terms of realizing improvements in its price negotiation strategy today. And the reason for that is that previous public, I'm referring specifically to Hoskins, previous advice by expert panels on the operation or how a pharmacare might work have always pointed to the savings that would be realized from coordinated, negotiated drug acquisition. So that's the element that Bill C-64 refers to, is the development of the advice or further understanding about how and where that might work. It is not intended to be a reference to the existing activities of the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance at all.
Well, I want to say thank you, but I'm still very unclear, because the PCPA has the ability to do a national bulk purchasing strategy. Is that not true?
So the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance acts on behalf of all of its members, so all provinces and territories in Canada, and in doing so coordinates the purchase for their public drug plans, and indeed some federal drug plans are part of that as well. So it has the ability to conduct those price negotiations. And so what Bill C-64 sets is it authorizes the minister to seek advice from Canada's Drug Agency in its position as having expertise in the field to guide the development of advice to support that future conversation amongst decision makers about how that might, how there might be improvements that could be realized. It doesn't commit that they would be adopted. It merely supports the development advice to support a conversation.
Yeah, so I guess, and through you, Chair, on behalf of everyday Canadians, the PCPA, for all intents and purposes, is a national bulk purchasing strategy. Is it or is it not?
It is the coordinated price negotiation upon which the letters of intent that are signed by, at that process are used by public drug plans
Sorry,
to acquire.
Mr. McDonald, I'm going to interrupt you. I'm not asking you for the caramel secret here, okay? That's not what I'm asking you. On behalf of Canadians, for all intents and is there another national bulk purchasing in secret that Canadians don't know about? Because if there is, on behalf of Canadians, please tell us. But for all intents and purposes, for public plans, this is the national bulk purchasing arrangement that we have at the current time. Is it not through the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance?
Yes, it is through the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance that all public drug plans coordinate their purchasing, their price negotiation to subsequently purchase.
As I said, I'm not asking you to define the theory of relativity here or the caramel secret, whichever is more difficult, but the...
Point of order,
what
Mr. Julian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am a bit uncomfortable with the line of questioning. We're getting from our witnesses complete answers, but actually, Dr. Ellis just has to read the bill. If you look at the principles, Section 4, and how it relates to Section 9 of the bill, those answers are already evident. So it is relevant, but I do find this a bit repetitive, this questioning, and it's also questions that are already answered by a careful reading of the bill.
You tried to couch it as a point of order, but it was a point of debate, I'm convinced. Go ahead, Dr. Ellis.
Thanks very much, Chair. And in spite of the fact of what Mr. Julian wants, there is a significant lack of definitions inside this bill, which to me is perplexing. It's perplexing because, you know what, one of the things that Canadians do not understand is how medications are approved in this country and how they are purchased and how those decisions come to be. And for a bill, and again, I'm sure even Mr. Julian could sit down at a moment's reading and read the 4-page pamphlet because it's not that difficult to do in a single reading because it's not rife with details. And in spite of the fact that the Costly Coalition would like us to simply pass this bill through, our job under the Westminster style of government is to provide a robust opposition to those things proposed in their willing and wasteful spending by the Costly Coalition. So what I'm trying to do on behalf of Canadians, unlike what Mr. Julian is want to do, is to allow this pharmacare pamphlet to pass without scrutiny, is on behalf of Canadians understand the system that exists now. And again, I would suggest that I probably know as much as there is to know about the purchasing system in Canada and the manufacture of medications, et cetera, and the prescribing thereof. And therefore, what I would suggest is that, again, this bill is not being truthful. This bill is suggesting, and again, there is a bit of humor in there when I ask you about the caramel secret and the theory of relativity. I'm not meant to be disparaging. We do have to have a bit of fun here. But that being said, on behalf of Canadians, what we're trying to do is to understand clearly what this bill is proposing. And I'm still not convinced that we are there. And again, as I said, I don't have a problem with comprehending the system that exists. What I would say is I'm having a problem comprehending your answer, not because it's in a foreign language. It's not. It's in one that's I can understand, and I'm sure if I were listening in the other official language that it would be translated appropriately. That being said, there appears, and again, I'm not trying to be disparaging, but an element of bureaucratic speak that is really not clear on behalf of Canadians. And I will take you a bit to task on that to say I'm imploring you on behalf of Canadians to be clear. And maybe, I know you don't like yes or no answers, but I'd really like you to attempt to answer them in the sense of the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance yes or no, is a bulk purchasing strategy that currently exists in which the public plans of Canada's territories and provinces and perhaps a few other partners participate at the current time. Is that true, sir?
That is true that they jointly negotiate, yes.
Great, thank you. So therefore, the wording in this particular amendment, which again, as I said previously, is related to contraception and diabetes, which my colleague, Mr. Doherty, has eloquently pointed out, is clearly laid out in this bill, that is exactly what the pharmacare pamphlet is about. And it therefore is about the continuation of a national bulk purchasing strategy. It is not about creating something new. You said that there may be some forward-looking idea at some time in the far future that it could possibly change the vision of allowing the minister to ask the CDA for advice. I don't think adding the words continuation of a national bulk purchasing strategy in any way, shape, or form is going to harm that potential or never to happen ability to ask the Canadian Drug Agency for advice, because they do now get advice from the former arm called CADIF that we've talked about. That is part of their mandate as well, is to talk about pharmacoeconomics and cost benefit. So I thank you again. In no way, shape, or form was I meant to be disparaging towards your answers, but I think it's important to seek clarity. And I think, Chair, that from the interventions that we have heard and the advice that we've obtained from our experts here this evening, that it's even more important on the basis of clarity and transparency for Canadians to understand that the amendment as proposed under CPC 9 is the appropriate amendment to bring clarity and vision to the pharmacare pamphlet. Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Mr. McDonald.
Mr. Nakvi, please.
Thank you, Chair. So we will be opposing this amendment. It builds on what I presented earlier, which is that this is a framework legislation that develops a framework around pharmacare. We, of course, are talking about the first phase around that framework that focuses on diabetes and contraceptive medication. The legislation goes beyond that in terms of developing a national bulk purchasing strategy, and somehow limiting the scope, as this amendment suggests, undermines the essence of this framework legislation, and therefore we think that it is counterproductive and really does not pursue the aim that the legislation is trying to do, which is to create a framework legislation around pharmacare, starting with the first phase, which is to make diabetes and contraceptive medications available to Canadians coast to coast to coast. Thank you.
Dr. Ellis, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Again, I'm not sure that I follow Mr. Nakvi's logic here to say that this is undermining any future ability to do anything. This is a service that is already provided by the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Therapies and Health, CADIF, and certainly one would believe that if they want to rewrite the potential future intervention of the Canadian Drug Agency, then I would suggest that this paragraph is not where that should happen. I believe, I can't quote you chapter and verse, but I do believe that there is a segment which talks about the Canadian Drug Agency, and I think that if Mr. Nakvi wishes to define what that might look like, then certainly that is something that we're happy to entertain. Again, on behalf of Canadians, our expectation is that there's an honesty here with respect to the national bulk purchasing that already exists on their behalf. Because if we don't define it as such, what this bill in its aspiration would suggest to Canadians is that they are going to get a better price for their medication somehow through this bill. And we know that when you look at the public plans that negotiate these prices, adding another 1 million people to that negotiation is not going to enable a better pricing effect. And we heard that again, if we want to talk about the facts, which Mr. Julian is often mentioning. The facts are, we heard testimony with respect to that. The Canadian bulk purchasing national bulk purchasing strategy that exists, and for clarity, we'll call that the PCPA, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, that what we heard from the manufacturers who are represented here, that their thoughts were that it was an incredibly rigorous negotiation that already exists in a market with small margins. Now, Mr. Julian was also obviously at that time wanting to say that these were lobbyists, when we know that everybody that appeared here as witnesses were lobbyists. That's what they were. They were all lobbyists. So to attempt to be disparaging on folks who have and run businesses and employ thousands of people across the country, to say that they are lobbyists, well, as I said, everybody sadly that appeared in the truncated
Point of order,
form.
Mr. Chair.
Of order from Mr. Julian.
Yeah, I have to ask you to rule on relevance here. Dr. Ellis seems to be wandering off again.
I'm not sure that there's been a significant veering. If you can make the connection to back to CPC 9, but I don't think you've gone that far astray, Doctor.
Well, you know, I mean, yeah, I don't even know what to say to that, Chair. I mean, clearly, I was talking about the system that exists now, the pricing that exists now, the lobbyists were here. I think, wow, you know what, I know that I use, anyway, I was going to say something very negative, but I shall not say that because that would be inappropriate. So, Mr. Julian, please pay close attention. And if you're struggling with that, then grab a cup of coffee.
Oh, please, direct comments through the chair. This is bound to descend into chaos if we start firing shots
Chair.
directly at people. Fire them through me, please.
Yeah. Maybe, Chair, you could ask Mr. Julian to grab a cup of coffee if he's struggling with his attention. Anytime, Chair. I apologize for directing it directly to Mr. Julian. It's much better to say it that way. Anyway, that being said, you know, what Mr. Julian was suggesting was that the good folks who provide medications to Canadians were not being truthful with their testimony that we heard. And of course, if we had more testimony, perhaps we could have heard opposing opinions, but we didn't. Because of Mr. Julian and the Costly Coalition, we were only able to hear 10 hours of testimony. So if he thinks that what they're saying is not true, then again, we'd be more than happy to hear more testimony, but because of their motion, just for the clarity for Canadians on closure that limited the amount of testimony that could possibly be heard, we were very limited on who we were able to hear from. So again, what we already have is an existing national bulk purchasing strategy under the auspices of the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. And it really is beyond belief that what both Mr. Julian and Mr. Nakvi are saying without transparency is that they don't think that's a national bulk purchasing strategy, that they think that perhaps in the future the Canadian Drug Agency will provide some of that. Whereas, you know, this is in no way, shape, or form limiting that ability to do it because we've already established that that goes on now. The pharmacoeconomic discussion happened previously before May 1st at Cadith and is now, I'm not entirely sure what's happening. Maybe Mr. McDonald, you could make this clear to the committee. That is there a joint CDA in Cadith, or Cadith is no longer relevant and they're out of the picture altogether? So perhaps before I go on, could you make that clear to the committee? Is the governing structure now solely the Canadian Drug Agency and not CADIF, or is there some sort of overlap at the current time? And Ms. Boudreau, it looks like you might want to answer, and if you do, please feel free. Thank you.
Sure. Well, in fact, a CDA is being built from CADIF. So CADIF continues to exist in the sense that the people that work there, its structure, et cetera. But the activities that are being added to CADIF, which are set out in the legislation, as you noted, Section 7, those are CADIF is growing into, if I can put it that way, they are the nucleus of the CDA. And maybe if you'll permit me, Chair, I would like to just make a couple of comments on the earlier questions that may help clarify the difference between PCPA and the purchasing strategy that's mentioned in the bill, if you'll permit me only. Yes? Okay.
Please.
Again, in the hopes that this would be helpful, just want to point out a couple of differences in PCPA. My colleague noted, as you did, that it is in regards to the negotiation of prices for public plans only. So just public plans and negotiations of prices. PCPA, in fact, does two things. So one by one, they negotiate prices. So they do have product listings agreements, so product by product. And then they have a framework with respect to generic drugs that's been in place for some time. I think whether that could be called a bulk purchasing strategy is really something you'd have to ask the PCPA itself. I would leave that to you to consider, but those are the two fundamental things that they do. The other thing I just want to point out is that the PCPA, in its negotiations, as I mentioned, they are price negotiators for pharmaceutical products only. And when we speak about the strategy, if you look at the term that's used, we do use a broader term, which is pharmaceutical products and so related products. And in that sense, because some of those products could be at a point in time in the context of bilateral agreements, it could certainly go beyond just the pharmaceutical products that are being negotiated for prices only in the context of the PCPA. Final thing I just want to note is that, as I mentioned earlier, the PCPA is the price negotiator for public plans, but there are also other procurement. I'll use the word procurement, even though that isn't necessarily what they do, but there are other reimbursement organizations, if you will, entities for products in Canada, such as hospitals and cancer agencies. So those types of things would not be part of the PCPA. And then finally, maybe just you noted a question on vision, and I did just want the committee to know that in leading up to the CDA and the creation and the context of what the activities of the CDA would be, which is reflected in the bill in the context of the minister being able to ask advice from the CDA, there was a transition office who did a lot of work looking at where there might be areas of improvement. So, in fact, that's the vision piece. The view is that there is room for improvement, as there often is, even though the PCPA has been in place since about 2010. So, just wanted to give a little bit of that context. I hope it's helpful.
Well, thanks very much for that. And through you, Chair, just perhaps a couple of follow-up questions related to that. Interestingly enough, if we're going to ask the CDA to do things that the PCPA is already doing, to me that would be redundant. And if we're going to ask them to do the similar things that CADIF is already doing, then why would we want to spell that out? I guess that's another part of it. And if I'm not mistaken, I would consider this a national bulk purchasing strategy, given the fact that they do negotiate one price for medications for all public plans, if I'm not mistaken. If I am, please correct me. And I think the final thing is and maybe I'll save it for later, but I'll give you some food for thought, is talking about the budgets for CADIF and the CDA, and understanding, because there is some cost associated with the stand-up of a new agency, which should be talked about in here. So I won't ask you that now, but I'd like to give you a heads up. Perhaps you have the information with you, and perhaps you don't, but if you don't, maybe we'd love to hear that at some point. So the question would say, obviously, if we're negotiating one price for medications, let's call it metformin, on public plans, that would, in my mind, and I believe on the minds of Canadians, be a national bulk purchasing strategy, even though, as you mentioned, you could certainly add on other agencies such as hospitals. There's no issue with that, although they do benefit certainly from similar prices as does elsewhere. And if the Canadian Drug Agency is taking over for CADITH, and they already do these things, then why would we need to spell that out? This would be a continuation of that work.
I may not have been clear. So the CADITH functions currently, before moving towards becoming the CDA, was quite limited to the what we call health technology assessment. The functions that would be added and the activities that are added are what's set out in the legislation. So there will be more that will be happening within the context of the new CDA than what currently is done by CADITH. And maybe finally, just to note as well that the PCPA is a construct of the provinces and territories, and what you see in the bill is that before the CDA would develop any advice, or the minister would ask for that advice vis-a-vis some of the functions that the CDA will do, there will be consultations with the provinces and territories as well. So in fact, there will be, collaboration and a lot of close work with the PCPA.
Well, thanks very much for that, Ms. Boudreau, and through you, Chair. I guess I'm still struggling with understanding. We're adding another layer of bureaucracy here, is what it sounds like to me, that even though that we have something that's functioning, the PCPA, and negotiating national prices for medications, as I said, let's take this medication called metformin in a very specific instance, is that price is being negotiated on a national basis for public plans. And so why would we need another agency to provide more advice? If there's already negotiations that exist, generally from public plans, why would we need more input? I don't understand that. And if you could explain it on behalf of Canadians, I'd love to hear it.
I would come back to the functions that the CDA will undertake that goes beyond, again, what CADITH does now. So data analyses, a lot of work around appropriate use, all of those things will inform how the strategy can come together. So none of those activities are currently done by the PCPA. So if you look at the activities that are set out in the bill, that's where you see the expanded work that CDA will be able to do and what they will be able to bring to then inform a strategy that the PCPA doesn't currently do.
Yeah, thanks for that. And through you, Chair, it's interesting you talk about appropriate use, and I certainly think that at some point we'll come to that, and it would be a shame if this pamphlet that's being rammed through, if we can't get to that amendment specifically to debate it related to appropriate use. It would appear that on behalf of my physician colleagues, certainly I would suggest that the last thing we need is another government agency telling independent practitioners who've been educated by our great country which drugs to use in certain situations. I mean, to me that seems overly draconian and a significant violation in terms of the ability to prescribe which medications. When you look at the system that currently exists, there's a prescription does not need to even have an indication on it. And therefore, a government agency beginning to encroach on that independent nature of the practice of medicine, to me, seems significantly burdensome and troublesome government overreach. Again, it's the vagueness of the wording that exists. And I wish I could sit here and say that I'll take the government at their word, that there will not be that significant overreach and interference with respect to the independent practice of medicine. However, I don't believe that to be true. So when I begin to look at the next several paragraphs, these are going to be incredibly troublesome. Again, with the potential meddling of the government with the independent practice. And, This is something which I can only hope will not come to fruition, and certainly something that I know myself and my conservative colleagues will be quite happy to fight against, that government interference. We know that many medications are used in an off-label fashion, which it concerns me significantly, not only in this bill, and I'll only mention this for a second, Chair, so that Mr. Julian doesn't lose his mind over it, but the Budget Implementation Act that exists now talks about significant increase in ministerial powers with the ability to limit